From the Gospel of Luke, 21st chapter, verses 5 through 19. Not going to be read it this morning, so I'm going to actually start the last three verses. Verse 17. You will be hated by all because of my name. That is the name of Jesus. But not a hair on your head will perish, because by your endurance you will gain your souls. By your endurance you will gain your souls. For the moment we have today, I want you to pray with me on the thought. Things are not always what they seem. Things are not always what they seem. Let us pray. Loving God, we are for the preaching moment. We ask that these words that come from my mouth, that have been delivered by you into my spirit, not fall on deaf ear, but may illuminate for those that listen, that there's a word for them to guide their lives in these days. Turpentine my tongue to speak your word and hide me behind the shadow of your rugged cross, so that the people will see all of you and none of me. And they will come to know you for the pardon of their sin and know that you are a mighty and merciful God who loves them, keeps them, and will always shine your favor upon them. We pray this prayer in Jesus' name. Let us all say amen. Amen. We may be seated in the presence of our Lord. Things are not always what they seem. Things are not always what they seem. I want to begin by telling you a little story. There were two traveling angels that stopped to spend the night in the home of a wealthy family. The family was rude and refused to let the angels stay in the mansion's guest room. Instead, the angels were given a small space in the cold basement. As they made their bed on the hard floor, the older angel saw a hole in the wall and repaired it. When the younger angel asked why, the older angel replied, "Things are not always what they seem." The next night, the pair came to rest at the house of a very poor but very hospitable farmer and his wife. After sharing what little food they had, the couple let the angels sleep in their bed where they could have a good night's rest. When the sun came up the next morning, the angels found the farmer and his wife in tears. Their only cow, whose milk had been their sole income, lay dead in the field. Things are not always what they seem. Things are not always what they seem. Do you remember that prior to the 2016 election for President of the United States, political analysts, news commentators, and exit polls indicated that Hillary Rodham Clinton was assured to be the first woman elected President of the United States of America? Her win would have signaled for the first time in our nation's history a transition of power between a woman and the first African-American President of the United States. For the first time, the presidential yearbook would have recorded a narrative that could not be erased from history's textbooks. But things are not always what they seem. If you recall, as the election results began to come in 2 years ago, much of America watched in astonishment. The map of the United States was turning as red as when God told Moses to tell Aaron to take his staff and stretch out his hands over the waters of Egypt to turn the water to blood. In fact, the move went from joy to sorrow for those who were ready to celebrate a Clinton victory. Even the reporters from the various news outlets like MSNBC and CNN sighed out loud, and the stock futures began to tumble. It wasn't the waters of Egypt that turned red, but the good old U.S. of A. Things are not always what they seem. Many people went to bed but woke up to a nightmare that they thought was merely a dream. Conversely, 45 in his camp sat anxiously as key states were too close to call. Even with the possibility of 45 winning, the Republican establishment was not confident that it would happen as well. Yet 75% of whites with no college degree voted for him, and white women who said they were offended by his repugnant behavior also voted for him. Who would have thought that racist, sexist, and xenophobic behavior would win any election, especially the election for the highest office in the land? Things are not always what they seem. And I remember thinking, my people voted. African Americans voted. We turned out in record numbers. Yet for all people of color, it still was not enough to win the presidential election against a man who spewed hate. We were once again reminded that popularity in politics does not win presidential elections, electoral votes do. And now, 2 years and 77 days later, we see that to make America great again means to make America hate again. Things are not always what they seem. I even contend that privilege has taken on new meaning. Privilege sees or doesn't see what it wants to see. It easily or selectively ignores the reality of others, all while admiring that which is a benefit toward themselves. Privilege doesn't mind destroying what little others have. Privilege gets the tax cuts. Privilege doesn't mind getting into better schools. Privilege has affordable health care. Privilege is not food insecure. Privilege has found ways to use the 13th Amendment to their advantage to disadvantage others. Privilege can be worn, but turns a blind eye to the sign of the times. Yet, the election night 2 years ago taught us something new. We learned that privilege is not always pristine and polished. Privilege also belongs to the rusty, dusty folk from the Rust Belt communities that want to protect their whiteness no matter what the cost to the rest of us. Things are not always what they seem. As we turn our attention to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus observes the ritual sacrifices of the people in the temple court. The disciples appear to be taking a tour of the temple. They are admiring and making notes of the items that adorn the temple walls and hung from the temple porches. What better place to put privilege on display? Yet these earthly treasures weren't museum gifts, they were ritual sacrifices. They stood out to the disciples because they were the earthly treasures of the wealthy. How quickly the disciples curated certain sacrifices over others. How convenient it was to ignore the sacrifices of the poor and the marginalized over the wealth of the privileged. How quickly do we size up people by the size of their car or the size of their real estate? How quickly do we pass judgment on what neighborhood someone is from, what places they shop? How convenient to ignore those without a title, over those with one. Things are not always what they seem. Jesus, overhearing their fascination, remarks that while the wealthy sacrificed out of their abundance, there was a poor widow that put in more than all of them. All the poor widow had were 2 small copper coins to live on. The greatest sacrifice was she gave beyond what she had left to live on. She was able to give of her poverty because her faith was strong. So even when things are not always what they seem, she elected to give in faith. Half of America elected to vote in fear. They elected to vote because they needed a new way to protect the majority because whiteness is moving toward minority. Things are not always what they seem. So this sets the stage for Jesus' teaching. So why does Jesus make these remarks about the temple? It is because to note that the second temple was built after Solomon's temple had been destroyed, and all of the wealth of temple had been stolen. The second temple represents God's return. The second temple was built by hands of a people who were in exile by Babylon. It's just like the White House. It was on the backs of slaves that built the White House for all those that come through it. In other words, even though Babylon reported the kingdom of Judah back to its capital Jerusalem, hardship lay ahead on the way to Jerusalem. The temple is a sign of God's presence and a place of God's safety. But it was built under the labor of tension and contradiction. Yet while the disciples were marveling at the temple, they were navel-gazing until Jesus takes over as tour guide and says to them that there will come a time that you will see none of these things any longer. As we have seen, we have moved into dangerous times today. 45 wants to build a wall to exile Mexican immigrants within their own country. But just as Judah and Jerusalem were part of the same province, Mexico and the United States are part of North America. America wants cheap labor, but America doesn't want the laborers on this side of the border. The privileged want to be in the land of the free by themselves and not home of the brave to those who dare to cross over. Things are not what they seem. When Jesus interrupts the disciples' obsession with things in the temple, he warns them that what goes up one day will come down. There are signs they need to look for. Jesus warns that there will be those who claim to be the Messiah and will come in my name and say, I am he. Certainly, 45 thinks, I am he, who can do more for the African American than the Latino American. Yet he won the election by baiting fears of the white working poor as if he were the slaveholder and they were the overseers. Things are not always what they seem. So what is Jesus saying to the disciples? Luke is giving us a 4-part sermon series that I'm going to sum up in 3 points. The first point is this: perception comes from seeing what you've been sensing. Perception comes from seeing what you've been sensing. We all have to deal with the perception that what we see is not always what is. If we don't sense what is, then we can't see what is. If we cannot sense God, we cannot see God. We see what we want to see rather than see what God has given us the sense to be true. Let me give you a few examples. Hillary Clinton was not the perfect candidate, but according to media, she lost the election because it became a matter of character over temperament. But I'm confused because doesn't 45's temperament speak to his character? Hillary Clinton lost because she was a woman. America wasn't ready for a woman after a black man had been in office. So here we are. We now have a president who lies all the time. He can't even tell the truth about where his own father is from. Things are not always what they seem. Let me give you a couple other examples. Kylie Jenner claims she is a self-made billionaire, but she has her wealth from her family. Things are not always what they seem. And as she still tries to fight the reputation that she's self-made, all we can say to her is, bye, Felicia. Mayor Rahm Emanuel, Police Chief Eddie Johnson, and the Federation of Police are angry with the state attorney and insistent that they be compensated over an alleged lie, but have spent more than $113 million in police conduct. Where was the rage over Laquan McDonald? Things are not always what they seem. They need to go somewhere now and have several seats because they continue, the boys in blue, to try to do us in because of their badge. But the badge might be brass, but it's awfully tarnished. And then just this past week, when you can go and shake the hand of a friend and then a couple of hours later be murdered by that same friend, things are not always what they seem. What we realize is sometimes that you're their friend, but they're not your friend. And the circle of people that you run with aren't always in your corner. They don't always have your back. Things are not always what they seem. And so now the world mourns the life of Nipsey Hussle because he became went from game to a CEO. Things are not always what they seem. In other words, people want your perception of them to be who they are not, but your experience of them tells you who they are. In other words, the lies you tell are to cover up the secrets you keep. The problem is, most people can sense a lie like a good Christian can sense a fake testimony. When someone gets a sense of you, they can see who you are not. In other words, the late Maya Angelou said, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Amen. Believe them the first time. We have lost touch, church, with reality. Too often we look at what glitters and don't stop to see if it's gold. We want that instant gratification in whatever way it comes. You know how this is. Ladies, some of you thought you were dating or married Prince Charming until you found out you weren't the princess, that you were the princess being charmed. Brothers, some of you believe you found the woman of your dreams until you woke up and realized you were dating or married a nightmare. Jesus reminds the disciples in the temple, he says, look, but don't touch. Just because it looks good to you doesn't mean that it's good for you. She or he may look good in the picture frame, but that's just one moment in time in a frame. When the words of Hallmark says the best, when they care enough to continue their very best, they're going to strike a pose and look good on the fireplace. Too many of us are trying to get the bright and the shiny. That's what's on the outside, but you got to know what's going on the inside. Because some of us can dress up and look good, but we can be jacked up and feel bad. Things are not always what they seem. They're not always what they seem. So this brings me to the second point of this message. Don't let persecution prevent your testimony from helping others. Don't let persecution prevent your testimony from helping others. We have to continue to deal with those who want to keep us down. There's a documentary, I don't know if you've seen it, but if you have Netflix, this documentary by Ava DuVernay called 13. It is about how the 13th Amendment led to the mass incarceration in the United States. The film opens with analysis of the amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States. Formally abolishing slavery in the United States, the 13th Amendment was passed by Congress on January 31st in 1865 and ratified by the states in December of 1865. But things are not always what they seem. When you examine the amendment closely, it's an amendment written with people of color in mind. The essence of the amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. However, the clause in between states except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. In other words, slavery nor involuntary servitude exists until you are convicted of a crime. Do you understand the disparity? Whites will not enslave themselves, but they will enslave others, but by increasing convictions for blacks for things like marijuana possession, failure to pay child support, and traffic violations. The documentary spends over an hour and a half tracing the path of conviction that created 2.2 million prisoners in the American justice system. The genetic map between slavery and mass incarceration explodes the mythology of black criminality and the successful measure by political culture to deprive us of our freedom over the last 300 years. When slavery was abolished, the one major thing it did was to disrupt the economy. Free labor made plantation owners rich and a rich southern economy. Free slaves decimated the economy. So the white Southern strategy needed a way to find us again. And the clause in the 13th Amendment does just that. It exploits blackness and mythologizes us as criminals. Slavery, Jim Crow, the war on crime, the war on drugs, persecuted, prosecuted, prison. And now we go after the Hispanics. We want them for free labor to help build our economy, but we don't want them over here at home. Things are not always what they seem. And when the injustices began to come to light, rather than finding new ways to criminalize people of color, the boys in blue stopped arresting us. Instead, they began killing us. Killing us by chokehold, killing us by lynching, killing us by firing off 16 shots, killing us by placing us in cages, holding cells without water or food or medical supplies, killing us by taking away our resources and social services and economic power in our communities. But the importance of Jesus' message is that where the public fails to sense, the church should see. 4 out of 5 white evangelicals elected 45 merely for the hatred of Hillary Clinton. However, my question is, how do people of faith reconcile the teachings of Jesus Christ with the character and temperament of a man who is abusive and offensive? How does your hatred of another person convince you to elect someone that is against your Christian principles? Church, what do we do? How do we become so duplicitous? Jesus says, beware that you will not be led astray. We have to watch the signs. We have to know the saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. The white evangelical movement, I believe, has been moving in the same direction. The highest population of white evangelicals resides in the southern states. They're the highest among racial and ethnic composition. Their education level is higher and having completed high school or less. Their income distribution is highest for those that make $35,000 or less. While our migration from the south was north and west, white evangelicals remain south and east. This is how the election was won and why people are fearful. They are looking for a savior with blue eyes and blonde hair to save them from those whom they persecuted. Things are not always what they seem. This is what's so frightening about this past election. And I raise the point because there is the possibility that 45 may win again. We don't want to hear it, but it needs to be told. If he is your choice, good for you, but I wouldn't want to be you. Because there's a connection here in the scripture. This past election between Prewinkle and Lightfoot is a key example. Less than 40% came out to vote. And regardless of what was going to happen, there was going to be a black woman in office. But if we sit by and don't vote, we will get things are not always what they seem. We have to be careful of what we do. But here's the connection to the scriptures. The temple represents that God is present and in their midst. It was built for religious or spiritual rituals and activities such as prayer and sacrifice. The synagogue was a place all gathered for worship and instruction. If you were a follower of Jesus, you risked persecution. Jesus says they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to the synagogues and prisons. They will arrest us as Christians, turn us over to the prisons and the church. You will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. Can I say this again? Jesus says immigrants, the Border Patrol agents will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to evangelicals and prisons. and you will be brought before the immigration and custom officials because I, too, Jesus Christ, your Lord and Savior, am an immigrant also. Can you see the duplicity of religious ideology? The temple and the church are in tension with each other. Separation in church and state motto. You can't separate the two. It's a fallacy. Because when the church begins to rise, the state rises up. When the church begins to shriek, the state rises up. You can't separate the two. The church folk is under attack. While nation will rise against nation and kingdoms against kingdoms, blue lives will rise against black lives. Politicians rise against citizens. Children rise against their parents. Immigrants who stole this land from the Native Americans will rise against immigrants who seek asylum from the oppressive governments. And evangelicals are rising up against God. Things are not always what they seem. So not only is the church being lured by false prophets, it is choosing to follow someone because of their hate for someone else. You can't call yourself a Christian and have no Christ in you. You can't hide behind the cross and think that we don't see you. John 17:21, and this is the mission statement of the United Church of Christ, says that they may all be one. The white evangelical church is signaling, folk. White fear is causing them to put Jesus in the closet and choose someone else. They're trying to hold on what it means to be white and right. They're in the temple relishing on their earthly treasures when America was great and how they can make America great again. And if we are not careful, the Christian church will not be the church of Jesus Christ, but the church against Jesus who gets crucified over and over and over again. But Jesus says in verse 13 that being persecuted will give us an opportunity to testify. We don't even have to prepare a defense in advance. For the God that fights our battles is the same God to give us what to say and the wisdom for our opponents to stand against. We must endure. God already has a plan. We must keep fighting even when we are being persecuted. In the words of Lady Michelle Obama, when they go low, we still have to go high. We cannot be accepting of and adjust to the cultural landscape we're in right now. We need to be outraged enough to fight back. We must continue protesting and marching. We must give witness to the injustice that befall us. We must fight. Is there anybody here that is ready to fight? Are you tired of being the victim? If you are, you need to fight. Are you tired of being harassed by the police? Then fight. Are you tired of black lives not mattering to black lives, Hispanic lives not mattering to Hispanic lives, Latino lives not mattering to Latino lives? You must fight. You have to fight. You have the right to stand up and fight. Are you sick and tired of being sick and tired? If you are, then fight. Fight for what's right. Fight against what's wrong. Don't let the people dismiss you because of how you're feeling. People expect you to put your feelings aside. If you're angry, be angry. If you're numb, be numb. If you need to cry, cry. If you're scared, you are not alone. But don't just sit by the sidelines and do nothing. No one has a testimony by sitting on the sidelines. Win or lose, you have a testimony because you stood up to fight. And you become a witness for others of how God has saved you. It's amazing how our communities can rest and sit when things are going well and then expect others to fight for them when they're not going well. Every one of us has a voice. I'm not saying that you got to lead the march, but you got to be part of the march. You got to have a voice that says, I am sick and tired of being sick and tired. And you are no better than I am. Right? Yes. Jesus says you will be hated by all because of my name. But not a hair on your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your souls. Things are not always what they seem. But this brings me to my third and final point. Persevere, because God's providence is near. Persevere, because God's providence is near. We must not quit. We don't stop fighting. We don't stop engaging. In other words, no matter what you are going through, you are in God's divine care. Because after a stunning victory, most of the concern was over what will 45 do. And at that time, we really didn't know anymore what he would do than Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders or anybody else who was running. But there are always in this life going to be upsets. Some folk are upset about what's happening in the Final Four. But there are always going to be upsets. But you couldn't write the script that said 2 African American women will be in a runoff for mayor of Chicago, and that the winner would be an African American woman who is also part of the LGBT community. You could not write that script. Because this has always been the Galewood script. You couldn't write that script, but God has a way of turning privilege on its head, because things are not always what they seem. God is still in control. So the good news is this: don't give up hope. Persevere, because God's providence is near. Don't look for a future led by a man or a woman. Look for a future in God. God will reveal to you in due season. Remember the angel story I was telling you about at the beginning of the message? Well, I left out the ending. This is how the story ends. The younger angel could not understand why the older angel would let bad things happen to good people. We all have that question. Why do bad things happen to good people? The younger angel could see, but he couldn't sense. He could see the wealthy home, but could not sense the impoverished spirit of the homeowner until they stayed there. He could see privilege, but he could not sense oppression and marginalization. He could see prosperity, but he could not sense the poor hospitality prior to their stay. Conversely, the younger angel could see the impoverished home, but he could not sense the wealth of the homeowner's spirit until he visited with them. He could see scarcity, but he could not sense abundance. He could see poverty, but he could not sense an extravagant welcome. The younger angel couldn't understand that out of the farmer's situation would come a testimony. So here's how this story ends. After visiting the 2 homes, the younger angel was infuriated and asked the older angel, how could you have let this happen? The first man had everything and you helped him. The second family had little but was willing to share everything, and you let the cow die. Things are not always what they seem, the older angel replied. When we stayed in the basement of the mansion, I noticed there was gold stored in that hole in the wall. Since the owner was so obsessed with greed and unwilling to share his good fortune, I sealed the wall so he wouldn't find it. Then last night, as we slept in the farmer's bed, the angel of death came for his wife, but I gave them the cow instead. Things are not always what they seem. You just missed your shout. You just missed your shout. He gave them the cow instead. God always has a plan. Always has a plan. What the disciples did not understand is that the destruction of the second temple would lead to a plan of salvation. God's plan of salvation was a son named Jesus. It's right there in John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. God's plan of salvation's name is Jesus. And who is Jesus? Jesus, he's the lily of the valley. and the bright and morning star. Jesus, who is the mother to the motherless and the father to the fatherless. It is Jesus who is friend to the friendless and hope to the hopeless. It is Jesus who is the doctor in the sick room and the lawyer in the courtroom. It is Jesus who is the bread of heaven who will feed you till you want no more. It is Jesus who is I am that I am. If you seek him, you will find him. If you knock, the door shall be open to you. Jesus who is our rock in the weary land and our shelter in the time of storm. Jesus who is the light of the world. Whoever follows him will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus, who is the good shepherd, he says, I know my own, and my own know me. Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father but by me. It is Jesus who says, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, they will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this, church? Do you believe this, church? That God's plan of salvation's name is Jesus. When it comes to human beings, our neighbors, sometimes our relatives, our friends, sometimes those we work with, things not always what they seem. But I can guarantee you this: if you try Jesus, Jesus is everything he says he is and more. The doors to my Father's house.